Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for connecting with us today for a discussion on FAA air charter safety for certificated flight instructors. Next slide, please. I'm Don Riley, your MC for this evening, and I'm an operations aviation safety inspector with the FAA Special Emphasis Investigations Team. We go by the acronym SEIT, and we're headquartered in Fort Worth, Texas. We are streaming live on FAA Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And in about 45 minutes or so, we will be taking your questions. Click the Google form link on the live stream to submit a question. Before we start, I would like to provide you with a few housekeeping items. First off, we're not here to solicit consensus advice or recommendations from anyone or to assign any tasks to the group, but we really are interested in taking your questions. Again, we posted a Google form link on the live stream, and feel free to submit a question there at any time. During the discussion, there will be some interactive polling questions, and right now, to get ready for those, you should go to your browser on your cell phone or your tablet and type in pollev.com/AVS managers as indicated there on the screen. Our FAA team is monitoring the live stream, so if you have problems at any time during the meeting, please give us a shout and we will assist you. For any reporters joining us on the live stream, please note that all discussions are for background only. Also, we are not attorneys and we are not providing legal advice. For that, you should reach out to a qualified aviation attorney that you trust. We would like to thank our friends and our colleagues in the FAA safety team for their help in making this a featured course for advanced wings credit at www.faasafety.gov. Next slide. Okay, now I would like to introduce you to Larry Fields. Larry is the FAA's Deputy Executive Director of Flight Standards. Larry oversees the development, coordination, and execution of regulations, policies, standards, systems, and procedures. He coordinates and executes program plans that govern the operations, maintenance, and airworthiness of all U.S. civil aircraft, including those of U.S. flag carriers and foreign carriers when operating in and over the United States, its territories, and possessions. His oversight responsibilities also include proficiency and certification of air agencies, flight schools, maintenance bases, and of qualified airmen other than air traffic control personnel. One note of importance, Larry is also responsible for all 78 flight standards district offices and 21 certificate management offices. So if the buck stops anywhere, it stops with him. Larry, over to you.
Thanks, Don. Good evening to everyone, and thank you for taking some time to join us for a frank discussion on the regulatory limits of cost sharing and what has become a persistent safety issue in general aviation, illegal charters. It's an issue that can get worse simply due to a lack of education or understanding on the part of general aviation pilots who may unknowingly witness or even participate in illegal charters. We know the vast majority of pilots and charter operators do follow the rules. And there's a great deal of work going on between the FAA and industry to crack down on the ones who are breaking the rules and exploiting the situation. The good news is that we're making great strides in this area. This evening, we're focusing on how you, the CFIs, can help your general aviation students and clients spot illegal charters and how they can avoid becoming part of the problem themselves. We are confident that with your help, we can reduce the threat. Illegal charters is an issue that affects pilots, operators, and manufacturers, but has the biggest impact on the traveling public, who have come to view all air travel as uniformly safe and virtually risk-free. They trust that the basic safety precautions airlines must follow will apply across the board to anyone operating an FAA-registered aircraft. Unfortunately, that trust can be abused by either willful misconduct of opportunists pretending to be legitimate air carriers, or, in some cases, pilots or operators who are misinterpreting the rules. When someone books a flight from a legitimate FAA-approved air carrier, there is a huge and largely unseen safety infrastructure supporting that purchase. That infrastructure and supporting regulations reduce the risk and greatly increase the probability of an incident-free flight from point A to point B. Along with required pilot training and testing regimens, there are safety and operational control requirements, maintenance rules, flight management, and insurance requirements, and other safety nets. Charter operators of larger and more complex aircraft can easily spend $20,000 per pilot each year on training. Illegal charter operators avoid those expenses, but at what cost to safety? For safety reasons, charter operators are required to limit the number of hours that pilots can fly, and they must have drug and alcohol testing programs in place. By avoiding those costs, illegal charter operators are able to undercut the prices of legal charter operators, further tipping the scales for unsuspecting customers. For example, a corporate pilot and his employer decided to lease the company's plane to several local businesses. The pilot and the company operated and billed for the flights, operating as an air carrier without the benefit of any FAA certification. Following an investigation, the pilot's certificate was revoked. But that's not all. The company was issued a $1.5 million civil penalty. Curiously, in this case, the FAA met with the pilot and offered to work with him and the company to come into compliance. For reasons only known to the pilot, he refused to even consider obtaining an air carrier certificate or to cease the operation. Here's how it might have gone if the pilot availed himself to the FAA's compliance program. We would have used its collaborative problem-solving approach to achieve compliance, and they might have avoided a $1.5 million civil penalty. Next, here's a cautionary tale for CFIs. I'm sure you are aware that flight instruction is an exception to the requirement to have an air carrier or air operator certificate under CFR Part 119. But, and this is a very important but, in order to take advantage of this exception, the flight instruction must be legitimate. A recent investigation revealed a situation in which the flight instruction was simply a sham to cover up illegal Part 135 operations. The sham involved passengers looking for transportation from one state to another to attend business meetings and then returning. The CFI saw this as an opportunity. He rented the aircraft from the local FBO and arranged with the passengers to fly them, alleging that the flights were simply flight instruction. These types of operations do not meet Part 119 regulatory requirements. You can see that the FAA takes these illegal practices very seriously. But I want to point out that in every one of these examples, the violations could have been avoided if the pilot had simply reached out to his or her local flight standards district office and simply asked if what they were doing was legal. To be sure, the answer may not have been what the pilot desired. However, those pilots might still have their certificates. These are safety issues, but they also have a direct economic impact on each pilot's current and future ability to earn a living flying and to pursue a career in aviation. I strongly urge each of you to help yourself and others avoid the mistakes made like the one I spoke about earlier. A few bucks is not worth your future as an aviator. Now, for legitimate charter operators, I would like to thank you for doing this the right way, and in doing so, protecting your customers and the reputation of our air transportation system. For any illegal charter operators out there, or those of you who may be contemplating such an activity, and sometimes it can start off innocently enough, I'm here to tell you that you have an opportunity to reach out to the FAA Flight Standards District offices and come into compliance. We'll work with you, but in the meantime, you have to stop conducting any type of activity that may be contrary to the regulations. For the flight instructors here, you are on the front lines for getting students or clients well-versed in what's legal and what's not. We'll teach you the difference in this webinar. We're here to educate and inform you this evening so that you can help educate and inform your students. Together, we can rid our industry of this issue. We also need you to be our eyes and ears in the field. We need everyone's help in recognizing, flagging, and eliminating this activity whenever and wherever we find it or suspect it. Your safety and the safety of your students and clients could be at stake, not to mention the reputation of our aviation system as a whole. Thanks again for participating in our webinar. And now I'll turn it back over to you, Don.
Okay, great. Thank you, Larry. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Should have slide 4 up. Yep, there we go. Okay, so I want to welcome all of our viewers on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. As I mentioned before, click on the Google form link on your platform to add your question. We look forward to a lively discussion and getting to those questions. Any that can't be answered here or we run out of time, we will post follow-up information on the FAA Safe Air Charter website. Okay, our expert panelists this evening are all operations safety inspectors with the Flight Standards Special Emphasis Investigations team. Joining me are Tim Allen, Rob Marchese, and David Volker. Next slide. Okay, here's a pop quiz for you. We have about 4 of these quizzes throughout the presentation. And using the instant poll that we mentioned earlier, we will give you these scenarios. Then we will ask you if the situation is legal or illegal. Answers are anonymous and aggregate. I know pop quizzes may have bad memories for you, but we're hoping to have a little interactive fun here. Please, if you haven't done it already, type into your browser pollev.com/AVS managers, like you see there on the screen, and you'll be able to see the aggregate answers instantly. Okay, here's pop quiz number 1. You are a commercial pilot who owns a 6-seat Piper Saratoga. You would like to fly to Madison, Wisconsin to go to a football game with 5 buddies. Can you share operating expenses? Click A for yes and B for no. And Rob will announce the results shortly.
All right, for the people that voted, we have 83% voted yes and 14% said no.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. And Tim, what's the answer to this one?
Well, thanks, Don. Well, the answer is yes. This is an example of legally sharing expenses as defined in 61-113C. There's a common purpose for this flight to Madison, Wisconsin. Back to you, Don.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. Okay, pop quiz number 2. Same scenario, but this one has you returning to your departure point to pick up 5 more friends. So now all 11 of you are going to the game. Can you do this? Again, click A for yes and B for no.
Okay, I'll just wait a few more seconds here. Some people are still tallying up here. All right, 30% said yes and 67% said no.
Okay, thanks again, Rob. All right, Dave, can you explain this one for us?
Sure. In this second example, this is an example where expense sharing was not legal. The pilot returned to pick up additional buddies, and the common purpose of the flight was lost. The first flight was to fly to Madison, Wisconsin with buddies to a game. The second flight was to transport more of his buddies. The pilot has now engaged in transportation by air and would need an air carrier or commercial operating certificate. Don?
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. All right, next slide, please. All right, let's take a look at our agenda for tonight. We will start with it's all about safety, then on to some key concepts to keep in mind. Then we'll talk about what illegal charters look like, introduce holding out and why knowing about it can help keep your students out of trouble. Then on to pilot privileges and limitations. Now we understand, of course, that y'all know the basics of these inside and out, but we want to introduce some things here to help your students from unknowingly crossing that line into illegal commercial transportation. Next, a hot button issue right now, expense sharing. We'll talk about the do's and don'ts of that. And along the way, we'll have a few more pop quizzes to discuss, and then we'll wrap up by giving you some resources to look at and where to go to get more information. Okay, next slide. Okay, it's all about safety, right? And although it's hard to tell, this was a Citation 500, and this crash occurred outside of Oklahoma City in 2008. And frankly, the operation of the aircraft was a mess. It was owned by a doctor in the local area, and the aircraft was managed for him by a company that leased it out to a 135 certificate holder, but they were only authorized to operate helicopters. And they in turn flew illegal charters on it. And the company that actually chartered this flight thought their passengers were on a legitimately operated flight. You know, unfortunately, catastrophic consequences do sometimes occur with these kinds of flights. So understanding what an illegal charter is and what they look like is important because they do come in all shapes and sizes, and they are all a threat to aviation safety. That's why these kinds of discussions are so very important to help keep your students out of trouble. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Tim now to take you through the next part on some basic concepts. Tim?
Thanks, Don. Well, what do we mean by illegal operations? They're disguised as Part 91 operations, but should be flown under a Part 119 air carrier or operating certificate. So what do illegal operations look like? They take many forms. A frequent one is the sham dry lease. It's actually a wet lease. Improper flight sharing, such as FlightNow. Blackbird was a rideshare app that held out to the public, placing aircraft, pilots, and customers together and collecting money. Next slide, please. When we think about operate, we think about manipulating the controls, but operate's much bigger than that. Operate means to use, cost to use as an owner or lessee. The operator is held responsible for the flight. Operational control. Your student's going to hear this term their entire career. It's an important term for them to learn. Operational control is the exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, and terminating a flight. Next slide, please. Initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. Very simple, right? Well, 135 pilots frequently believe because they're manipulating the aircraft in flight that they're operating the aircraft. Therefore, they, the pilot, have operational control. What the pilot does have is pilot and command authority, the responsibility for the safety of the flight. A very serious responsibility, but a different authority and responsibility from operational control. Operational control deals with where, when, and with whom, and even the conditions of flight and more that are acceptable. The pilot under 135 did not choose the day of the flight, the destination, or the passengers that are being carried. Those are very few of the operational control functions of the certificate holder. Next slide, please. Students should know about operational control. Wet leases involve the lease of the aircraft and at least one crew member is provided. A dry lease, as an example, would be Ford Motor Company has 5 Gulfstream 650s that they own. Business picks up, so they lease a 6 Gulfstream 650 for a year. Their pilots crew the aircraft and their mechanics maintain it just like the others in the fleet. At the end of the year, business moves to normal and they return the 650 to the owner. We've seen sham dry lease operators providing laminated operational control cards to the lessee in case the FAA ramp checks the aircraft. Later, when interviewed, the lessee could not explain the elements of operational control and did not understand operational control. The coaching did not work. Next slide, please. In its basic form, operational control is legal aircraft, legal crew, and flight management. It's a pillar of FAA safety and a key to safe operations. Next slide, please. Which rule to operate under? If we're taking people for compensation or hire from place to place as a common carrier, then we need an air carrier certificate or an operating certificate as a 135 operator. A higher level of safety is required by the regulations to protect the flying public. They're trying to find safe air transportation. The regulations require drug testing, flight and duty times, economic authority, and pilot training and testing as a few of the higher levels of safety. Back to you, Don.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. All right, folks, time for another pop quiz. So this time you're a flight instructor and you're also an air tour pilot. The boss of the air tour says you can conduct an air tour and give flight instruction at the same time. That way you're not limited to the 25-mile limitation of the tour. What will you say? Go ahead and vote now. And again, it's A for yes and B for no.
And the results are in, and I guess we picked a too easy of a question because everybody said no on this answer. So the correct answer is no. So what you would want to do is review the contents of 14 CFR Part 119.1E as an echo for yourselves and your students. Now, many think that 119.1E echo are different things that you can do with a commercial pilot certificate. And it's actually a list of activities that don't require an air carrier or commercial operating certificate. Student instruction is listed under E1, Echo 1, and CFR 91-147, the air tour, is under E2, Echo 2. The point that we wanted you to take away from this question is to be cautious in any creative workaround of regulations. There are processes and procedures to obtain deviations or exemptions from regulations to receive authorizations to conduct these activities. Next slide. So why do people conduct illegal charters? Well, we have three groupings: the clueless, the careless, and the criminal. So the clueless are ones that just don't really get it and they truly don't understand. Usually these are non-aviation folks or inexperienced pilots. Now, the careless person is one that may say, hey, look, I contacted my non-aviation attorney or accountant and they said that I'd be okay. The careless may put forth some effort to comply, but they'll come up short. Now, the criminal knows that it is wrong and chooses to do it anyway. In our investigation experiences, we have seen a mixture of all three. Also, we have seen plenty of criminal type people claiming that they are clueless. But as you progress with more certificates and ratings, you become more culpable and responsible for your actions. So I like to encourage all of you to do yourself and your students a favor and ask questions. Ensure that you and your students have an understanding of illegal charter and its different forms, and that the operations that you are conducting fall under the appropriate regulations. Now, aircraft ownership is expensive, and companies are trying to offset these expenses. And there's the fixed cost of insurance, hangar, and maintenance. and that might be a reason why they conduct illegal charters. Normally, there's a 7.5% federal excise tax on all charter flights. Also, avoiding the costs and effort of an FAA 135 certification is a possible reason to conduct illegal charters as well. Now, regardless of the reason or strategy, these illegal operations have an advantage over the legitimate operator in terms of money. Next slide. Now, this is one of the most important slides in my opinion, is what do illegal charters look like? Now, Tim talked about dry leases. Now, dry leases is between an aircraft owner, which is the lessor, and the operator or user, which is the lessee. And there are responsibilities that the lessee must have in place. And it is very difficult for a non-aviation speaking person to comply with these requirements. The dry lease will have specific requirements and responsibilities in place. However, at the end of the day, you may have a perfect lease that is written by the best aviation attorneys, but it doesn't matter what is written on paper. It matters how the flight is actually being operated. So you can read Advisory Circular 9137B as in Bravo. If you read that advisory circular before you ever fly as a crew member in a dry lease, you could save yourself possibly some heartache. I encourage your students to look up the 9137 Bravo for dry lease flights. If you show up for a dry lease flight and the lessee doesn't know who you are or how you are qualified in the aircraft, the red flags, alarms, and whistles should be going off. Now, Part 91 management companies may manage an aircraft for an owner. Now, if the aircraft is being used outside of the registered owner, that could be a problem. Part 135 certificate holders that don't have aircraft approved on their certificate. Now, this was an example that Don provided in the beginning of that citation in Oklahoma City. That was a helicopter 135 operator, but was not authorized for fixed wing aircraft. Now, demo flights. Now, demo flights are sales demonstration flights, and they may be disguised to offer illegal charter. Fake flight instruction is pretending to offer flight instruction in lieu of air transportation flights. And expense sharing with others that would be considered inappropriate. And Dave will address expense sharing later in this presentation. Next slide. Another advisory circular is 120-12A or 12 alpha, is an advisory circular that helps explain the difference between private carriage and common carriage. Common carriage is air transportation that requires certification under Part 119. And that certificate that is being used is a 135, a 121, or even a 91K operation. Now, the elements of common carriage are the following. It's the holding out or willingness to transport people or property from place to place for compensation. Next slide. So talking about holding out, there are different ways that you can hold out. The most direct method is advertising, but also holding out through reputation or word of mouth are the most common. Next slide. And in terms of compensation, compensation is a broad and a word that includes more than being paid in cash. It could be the promise of money, goodwill, or the expectation of future business, or the free transportation as notified here in step number 4. Free transportation by air would be like a hotel or a casino that is offering free transportation with the expectation that their guest or customer is going to spend some money at their facility. And then the 5th item is accruing flight time. Just as a pilot, accruing flight time alone and not receiving any money or compensation for it, accruing flight time is considered compensation. Next slide. Some red flags that you may see is if the company provides the aircraft and at least one crew member, yet attempts to transfer operational control to the consumer, would be a red flag. As Tim had addressed earlier is a lack of safety briefing or passenger briefing cards would be a red flag. Legitimate operators are very cooperative with FAA inspectors and anybody that's evasive about any questioning of any ramp or what kind of conduct that they're doing would be a red flag if they're not cooperating with FAA inspectors. And next slide. And now I'm going to pass it on to Dave.
Thanks, Rob. In this slide, we're talking about privileges and limitations of a private pilot. Part 61 tells you that a private pilot generally cannot act as pilot command for compensation or hire. Remember, though, that money is not the only form of compensation, although it does seem to be most everybody's favorite. Goodwill, the hope of future business, and as Rob said, flight time is considered compensation. I think this is a good place to mention that sharing expenses is considered compensation. And if it's done correctly, it is legal compensation. This is an exception to the rule prohibiting compensation to a private pilot. Expense sharing per 61-113C is permitted when a private pilot pays not less than a pro rata share, that means equal share, of the operating expenses with all passengers, provided that the expenses only involve fuel, oil, airport expenditures, or rental fees. And very importantly, there must be a common purpose for the flight. Transportation of the passenger is not a common purpose. Building flight time is not a common purpose. Advisory Circular 61-142 is a fairly recent publication, and it is very well written. It describes numerous situations that will give understanding of a legal versus illegal expense sharing flight. Next slide. In this slide, we're talking about privileges and limitations of a commercial pilot. According to Part 61, a commercial pilot can act as pilot in command for compensation or hire, provided he or she meets the requirements of the operating rule under which the flight is conducted. So a banner tow pilot operating under Part 91 must be current and qualified under Part 61. However, transporting persons or property for hire will require certification and qualification as an air carrier or commercial operator, and the flight must be operated under Part 135 or 121. I was having a conversation one day with a very experienced pilot of a Part 135 certificate holder. He said to me, David, he said, Part 61 under commercial pilot privileges, it says that you can carry persons or property for compensation or hire, doesn't it? I responded with yes. And what does the rest of the sentence say? And provided the person is qualified in accordance with this part and with the applicable parts of this chapter that apply to the operation. So I asked him, do you operate under Part 61, the pilot certification rule, or do you operate under an operating rule such as Part 91 or 135? There was a deafening silence, and then he said, oh, he finally got it. Part 61 states certificate privileges, but you must comply with the operating rule. And remember that a pilot himself or herself cannot hold out. They cannot advertise to provide transportation. This would require Part 119 authority as a common carrier or commercial operator. As Tim mentioned earlier, Blackbird was an example of where the public was really drawn in. Blackbird was an application that you downloaded to your computer or your cell phone. The customer electronically clicked the agree button, effectively signing a lease agreement for an aircraft, a lease agreement that was probably never read. The customer didn't have any real understanding of the transfer of legal responsibility by becoming a lessee. The customer, now known as the lessee, separately chose a pilot for the flight, a pilot whom they had never met and probably would never meet again. And although through the app, the customer paid for the aircraft, then they separately paid for the pilot. The theory was that the newly minted lessee separately chose an aircraft, separately chose a pilot, and therefore via the lease The person who just became the lessee had operational control. The legal determination was that the pilots who participated in the Blackbird program were holding out to the public via the app, meeting the definition of common carriage, and therefore had to have a Part 119 air carrier certificate, i.e. Part 135. I'd like to mention here that the lease was many, many pages long, and not one lessee that we interviewed knew what they had signed. The point is that the lessee was really only looking for transportation and not a lease with all of the responsibilities and legal liability associated with becoming a lessee. Next slide. I know you've heard it a few times now. The privileges and limitations conferred upon pilots are separate and distinct from the operational authority required to conduct the flights. Pilots are certificated under Part 61, but operate under Part 91 or 135 or 121. Again, the Expense Sharing Advisory Circular, AC 61-142, does a great job of explaining expense sharing. And yes, a commercial or ATP exercising private pilot privileges can share expenses. But remember, no pilot should hold out without the operational authority held by an air carrier or commercial operating certificate. This can be confusing. Although ATPs and commercial pilots can exercise the private pilot privileges of expense sharing, ATPs and commercial pilots cannot hold out to expense share. Instructors, please teach your students how to stay out of legal trouble. Next slide. No pilot should hold out without the operational authority of an air carrier or commercial operating certificate. Here is an expense sharing example gone bad. The pilot is talking to a friend about his upcoming flight to Las Vegas. The friend says that he needs to fly to Phoenix that same day. So they agree to share expenses at Phoenix and then continue to Las Vegas. What's wrong here? What's wrong is that the pilot had no reason, he had no purpose to fly to Phoenix, except for transporting the friend. This flight would be contrary to legitimate cost sharing allowed under Part 61, 113C. Don?
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. Next slide. Okay, here's our next and final pop quiz, and it's going to be a two-parter. So a commercial pilot owns his own airplane and is asked by someone to fly them to Las Vegas, popular destination. The pilot is offered reimbursement for the cost of fuel and hours on the airplane that the pilot owns. Can you do this legally? Vote now, please.
And the results are still coming in. I'm going to wait a few more seconds here.
You're keeping us in suspense, Rob.
Oh, they keep changing on me. All right, so as of right now, 20% say yes and 80% say no.
Okay, great. Dave, go ahead and take us through this first part.
So the question here is, can you do this legally? The illusion here is that since the pilot did not solicit for the flight to Las Vegas, and because the pilot was not compensated, the flight was legal. Is this true? No. The pilot was compensated by flight time, goodwill, or some expectation of future business. Be careful. Although not explicitly stated, there also could be a holding out by reputation or word of mouth. The question to ask is this: how did the passenger know to ask this pilot, if not by reputation? Some examples of holding out in other ways are the internet, newspaper, bulletin board, etc. An important point: aircraft ownership does not eliminate the requirement for an air carrier or commercial operating certificate. Don?
Okay, great. Next slide. All right, same scenario. Okay, this time, can you share the expenses? Go ahead and vote now.
right, looking at the results right now, we have 25% say yes, 75% say no.
Okay, Dave, go ahead and explain this answer, please.
Okay, so in this scenario, the question is, can you share expenses? As we just read in this scenario, the pilot had no common purpose for the flight. The flight to Las Vegas was only taking place because the passenger needed transportation to Las Vegas. The pilot was only going because he was offered reimbursement for fuel. In this scenario question as well, an air carrier commercial operating certificate is required, and therefore sharing expenses would not be legal. Don?
Okay, thanks a lot for taking us through those, Dave. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are some of the resources available to you when questions arise, and we know that they will. We here at the FAA, we have a Safe Air Charter website. Okay, the easiest way to get there actually is to type into Google FAA Safe Air Charter, and it'll be the first one that pops up. This site contains things like red flags that Rob was talking about, links to legal interpretations, pilot information and letters, court cases, et cetera, et cetera. And it will help you keep you and your students informed. The National Air Transportation Association, or NATA, also has a great website to avoid illegal charter. That's pretty self-explanatory by looking at the website there. If you suspect an illegal charter or observe one while you're out on the ramp, you can use the NATA website to report it there. You can also use the FAA hotline to submit an online report if you observe an illegal charter. Your local FSDO and FAA safety team are always available. Please feel free to call your local office for help and guidance when you have questions. It's better to get your questions answered before something happened. There's also a video series available that can help folks with getting a 135 operation going. We also want to mention that the FAA has a large social media presence. To find out more information, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Okay, next slide. All right, we don't want to forget about the rules, right? Part 91, 119, and 135 are critical to understanding the difference in private and commercial flights. And don't forget about Part 61 also, which Dave talked about in depth. The 3 advisory circulars that were mentioned tonight are very informative, and they can help you and your students discern between legal and illegal operations. Next slide. Okay, this briefing, along with a live recording of today's webinar, can be found at the FAA's Safe Air Charter website, which we talked about earlier. Also, this webinar is available for advanced wings credit. You'll find the course under featured courses at www.faasafety.gov. Make sure to log in, and you have to take the quiz to get the credit for that. Next slide. Okay, we wanted to give you a sneak peek at the FAA Safe Air Charter homepage, but we especially wanted to point out the interactive tab down where the red arrow is there. Posted there is an interactive video on building flight time legally. Please go check it out. Next slide. Okay, folks, that concludes our panel presentation, and we have lots of questions coming in. But go ahead and please click on the Google form in Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and ask your questions. But before we get to the audience questions, I have a question for the CFI audience. Do you fully understand your responsibility to teach your students what they can and cannot legally do with their pilot certificate? Okay, let's see. All right. Let's see, the first question we received is from Michael, and it states, says Part 119E1 talks about student instruction, and E3 talks about training flights. These are exceptions from the 119 certificate requirement that Rob talked about, but what's the difference between the two? Dave, can you take that one?
Sure. The first one talks about student instruction. That is instruction that is conducted in accordance with Part 61. For instance, preparation for a private or commercial or an instrument rating. Training flights is training that might be required to maybe meet an insurance requirement that are not part of 61 certification requirements. Training such as to be a banner tow pilot or a crop duster pilot. Don?
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. All right, next question is from Sherry. And she asked, can I bring a friend along on a cross-country duel and she pays to go to a business meeting? Tim, how about that one?
Okay, Don. Well, we've kind of got a mixture of what we've discussed here. The flight instruction is fine on a cross country, but to provide air transportation during an instructional flight and have someone pay for that air transportation would not be within the regulations. Back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Tim. All right, go ahead and get your questions in on the Google form link. The next one is Curtis asks, the owner is holding out without my knowledge. Can I get into trouble for flying the aircraft? Rob?
And read that one more time again, Doug.
He says, the owner is holding out without my knowledge. Can I get into trouble for flying the aircraft?
Okay, thanks, Don. And I recently had a court case that actually was part of this, and the answer is yes. You can get without your knowledge. It's important for you as a pilot to make sure that the operation is in the guidance or within the regulation of the operating rule that you're operating. And I would encourage you to ask questions to ensure that you're flying under Part 91. So it's very important to ask questions, but yes, you can get in trouble.
Yeah, it's always better to ask questions like we talked about earlier before something happens, for sure. Another one from Lewis asks, what questions can I or my students ask the aircraft owner to make sure that I'm not conducting an illegal charter? That's a good question. Anybody want to take that one?
I can take that one, Don.
Okay.
As a professional aviator, they are paying you not just to be able to be a professional pilot. They're also hiring you to make good aviation decisions. So you want to ensure that the operation is being conducted under Part 91. So some of the questions you could ask is, who are the passengers and how do the passengers relate to the registered owner of the aircraft? Are the passengers, are they being charged? Are they receiving any kind of benefit? Is there any kind of goodwill or future exchange of any kind going on? And then maybe ask, how did they hear about this? Did they hear about it through reputation? Does the owner even know who these people are? And are they operating under a dry lease? So those are just a few questions that they could ask. Don? Okay,
thanks a lot, Rob. A couple of questions about how to get a copy of this presentation, and the webinar is going to be archived on the FAA YouTube page. Anyone can go back and look at it. Okay, another question came in. If you own an airplane and your friend wants you to fly them to a different city a couple hours away, how can that be done without breaking regulations if you don't have a common purpose to go down there?
I'll take that one.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
I don't think you can. I don't think that you can pay for the flight without a common purpose or a reason. In other words, he came to you because he knew you were a pilot and he's going to pay for the flight. And there was no reason for the pilot to go except for the fact that the passenger was going to contribute to the cost of the flight. So no, I don't think you can do that. That would clearly be an illegal cost sharing arrangement.
Okay, thanks, Dave. All right, let's see. Next question. Something was mentioned about flight sharing being considered compensation with a Facebook group for pilots get together to plan flights with each other because they are building flight time to reach ATP minimum, but they are splitting the cost of the flight to be legal or illegal. So I guess, would that be legal or illegal is the question. You guys want me to read that again?
Well, there was a common purpose that they were trying to build flight time.
It's a flight sharing. Would flight sharing be considered compensation? I guess cost sharing, with a Facebook group of pilots get together to plan flights with each other because they're building flight time to reach their ATP minimum. And they're splitting the cost of the flights. So, sounds like flight sharing. Would the flight be legal or illegal, those flights?
Well, unless you were going to answer that one, Tim, I'll jump on that one. I think we mentioned it earlier, the building of flight time is not a cost sharing rationale. That is not a justification for cost sharing. There's got to be some other purpose other than the flight in and of itself. So on the face of it, without knowing anything more than what's there, doesn't sound legal at all to me. Tim, you have add to that?
No, I think you addressed it, Dave. That was my concern, was what the common purpose was that was stated in the question.
Yeah, and I'll just say to the audience, scenario-based questions are difficult sometimes because if you in real life, if you're changing any variable to the scenario, then something may change. So again, we're not attorneys, and this isn't legal advice. We're trying to figure out this like you guys are. So okay, here's another question that came in. What is the monetary value of flight time in terms of compensation if an air tour operator or an air operator hires a pilot but doesn't give them a paycheck because they consider flight time is suitable? Will the air tour operator be exempt from minimum wage requirements? Yeah, I'm not sure. Anybody
That's
want to try to take a?
Yeah, that's a labor standards question.
Yeah,
Wouldn't be within
yeah,
federal aviation regulations. Sorry about that one.
yeah. And I don't think I've ever heard of how much flight time would be. So
Right.
anyway.
My suggestion is charge him double.
Okay, here's another one. It says, is it considered compensation if private pilot flying cars are paid by third parties such as supporting a parent? Would taking this parent for a ride constitute carrying passengers for compensation? If a private pilot are flying cars, I'm not sure what that means.
I don't understand the first part of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe they could resubmit that question again. And
Yeah, whoever did, if they could, that would be great. All right, we have a couple more questions coming in here. If a private pilot's flying costs are paid by a third party, such as a supporting parent, that was the qualification. Again, I think we need more information on that scenario. It says we're taking this parent for a ride considered, taking the parent for a ride consider a pet constitute passengers for compensation. Yeah, I'm still not getting it. There's one that came in on enforcement and talks about if a student gets unknowingly caught up in something that's violatable, what does the FAA normally do if they unknowingly do it and they want to be cooperative? What are some of the options, it sounds like?
Well, we have the compliance action or compliance philosophy that the FAA's instituted recently. And so with any person that we have that has violated the regulations, we give them an opportunity to cooperate with us and tell us what happened, and then to develop a corrective action plan that's agreeable to both that person and the FAA to stop the activity, and then successfully keep them from violating the regulation in the future. So that's provided that the person wants to cooperate and develops a corrective action plan that's able to be implemented and verified, provided that it's not an act that was deliberate. And I think that's what you had in your scenario there, Don, that it was not a deliberate act.
Right. And I think, Tim, what you said, cooperation is the key there too. So, okay, here's another one came in. Can a nonprofit raise funds to fully cover the flight cost of their own aircraft for transporting people for no cost to the passengers?
We lost you for just a second there, Don. You want to try it again?
Okay, if anybody has experience with a nonprofit, it says, can a nonprofit raise funds to fully cover the flight cost of their own aircraft for transporting people for no cost to the passengers? So it sounds to me like basically the nonprofit is paying.
The rule, they have to comply with 91-146. So I don't have it right in front of me to quote, but 91-146 talks about charitable flights. And as long as you're in compliance with that rule, I think you're golden. There are quite a few qualifications in that.
I would concur with that, Dave. It's good advice.
Dave, what was the rule again? Say it again.
91.146.
Okay, next one says, can a private pilot be paid for flying a tow plane like a glider tow?
Yes, they can. That's the short version. Yes. It's an exception both in 61-113, and it's also an exception in the rule that allows for a private pilot to be a tow plane pilot. There's some experience requirements, total time requirements, but yes, they can.
Okay.
And maybe the justification, just for addition, maybe the justification for that may sound a little odd, but they're not transporting persons or property for hire anywhere, are they? So maybe that's the justification for it.
Right. Thanks, Dave. Okay, so is it okay for a flight school to encourage students to split flight time with each other by posting a list of those interested in doing such? I guess he's asking about, would that be considered holding out? Do we have enough information there to answer that one?
I don't think so.
Okay. Okay, next one is, how can I be paid for flying in a Part 91 operation?
Well, are we talking about a Part 91 operation in which you are the pilot for a corporation? That would require you to be at least commercially rated, and you would be operating on the behest of the company. The risk there is the company going to put somebody with you as a passenger that is not part of the company, and the company is getting paid for that transportation. That's a real risk. But ultimately, if you become a corporate pilot, the company does still have responsibility for your actions. And that's kind of the difference. They still are responsible for those decisions you make. So the legal liability remains with the aircraft owner or company that's hired you.
Right. Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, can two students take a lesson together where they take turns flying and observing during a cross-country lesson?
Can you read that one more time?
Absolutely. Can two students take a lesson together where they take turns flying and observing during a cross-country lesson?
I think they're saying there's a flight instructor on board, and they just swap from the pilot seat to the rear seat to watch the other pilot do their training.
Okay. Okay, here, this is a clarification back to the Facebook pilot group. It says, please clarify if pilots on Facebook, if, I guess it's a Facebook group, and arrange to split costs solely to build time, is that legal, and where is the interpretation? I'm still not sure whether we have enough information to answer that.
On the face of it, it sounds like it's holding out because Facebook is a pretty large audience, and the purpose of building flight time is not a common purpose that would be justifiable for sharing expenses. That doesn't sound right. Either that or we're not hearing all the facts.
Okay. So that's the fail-safe answer probably. Okay, so can you get paid or reimbursed as a private pilot flying as a volunteer for pilot and pause flights?
Well, I think Dave's advice on 91-146 would apply to that as well.
Okay. Can a company pay full aircraft rental to allow their employee to operate an aircraft in the furtherance of a business, of their business? So the way I'm reading this, an employee, that a company rents an aircraft and one of their employees is going to operate it in the furtherance of their business. So can they pay the employee to do that?
Well, it doesn't specify whether they're a commercial pilot or a private pilot. A commercial pilot could fly for hire, incidental to their own business. If that's, if they weren't going to haul somebody else in the aircraft that paid for air transportation, that would generally fit within the rule.
Right. Because the bottom line, if they rent an aircraft, I think that they rent an aircraft and they use it in their business, and he has a commercial, I think he could get paid if that's
It was incidental to his business, which could not be air transportation, but it's incidental
right.
to business. And the other question was this incidental to the employee's business or was it incidental to the employer's business? Well, it's not clear to me.
Yeah, it's not clear, but it says aircraft in the furtherance of a business, but it could be their business or his business. So yeah, it's a little unclear.
And just to add to that, Don,
Sure.
and one thing that I've seen also in the FBO business, it's really difficult from the insurance, and we don't get into the insurance side of the house, but the insurance would be kind of difficult to tie in a business for that, because usually they identify a pilot with that. So I'd be cautious, even if you could do that, which I don't think there's enough information, but even if you could, I'd be cautious about from the insurance side of the point, whether there's coverage or not.
Okay, thanks, Rob, for adding that in there. Okay, we want to remind you to send your questions in to safeaircharter@faa.gov. You can continue to do that. Okay, here's an Alaska Lodge question. Let's see, is it true Alaska Lodge operators can use aircraft owners in a Part 91 operation carrying guests to and from, and that's where it ends. I'm guessing to and from the lodge.
There is a legal read written by a guy by the name of Martin, and I would suggest you need to read that because it doesn't, the way that question is written, I don't think they have all of the information. It involves a guide transporting persons back there. It's not just a commercial pilot flying back to the lodge. It requires some other services rendered by the pilot. And I'm sorry, I don't have it right in front of me, but it was written by Martin. You could look it up, the Alaska rule, I believe.
Is that Howard Martin, Dave?
It is, thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, let's see here. So this next question, are you saying that if my friend has to go to a destination for a meeting, that I can't fly her and share the expenses?
Well, I guess I'll take that one again too. That's a shared expenses issue. What was your reason for going on that flight except to transport? So when ultimately you ask the question, if the only reason the flight took place was because of the shared expenses in transporting a person there, it would not be legal. There would have to be a reason other than transporting that person for you to take that flight.
Yeah, and Dave, you talked about it a number of times. The common purpose test is critical in these things.
Right, and that common purpose, again, cannot be the transportation of somebody else.
Right.
It can't be for the building of flight time. It can't be because you're being compensated. That's not a common purpose.
Right.
And just to reiterate, like the poll questions we had about going to the Madison football game, taking your buddies there, you had a common purpose and it worked fine. Now you going back to pick up additional people and going back, and you still have that common purpose. Your purpose was to go to the game, but you were already at the game. You're already at the location, and you're simply going back and forth for air transportation. So the common purpose was lost. So the common purpose test is extremely important, like Don and David said.
Right. There's another question about pilot and pause flights. And Dave, just one more time, what was the regulation people really need to go look at?
Say it again.
For nonprofit.
91-146.
Okay, do you have to be a certificated flight instructor to get wings credit for the seminar? That is a question I am not sure about, to be honest with you. But we should post the answer to that on after this is over on the website. All right, some more coming in here. Okay, the answer is actually anyone who has access can take the test for the wings credit. Okay, questions are slowing down here, so. Go back through my list, make sure I didn't miss any. Okay, one more is coming in. How is it that pilots looking to build flight time together and share pro rata expenses cannot be considered a common purpose?
Well, I think the reference would be Advisory Circular AC 61-142. And it clearly points to the fact that building flight time is not a common purpose. So.
Okay, and for the audience, that advisory circular was referenced multiple times. And if you haven't looked at it, it is a great advisory circular. It gives scenarios, legal and illegal, and so we all highly recommend you go look at that for sure. Okay, another one's coming in. Now's when we should have the Jeopardy music. Okay, this says, and I'm not sure we can answer this, but let's see. Is writing off aircraft expenses for charity considered compensation? Any experience with that?
No.
It says, actually a clarification, is writing off aircraft expense for charity use considered compensation? I don't know that we can answer that one. Okay, can you give a flight review in a high performance airplane if you don't have a high performance endorsement, but you're not acting as PIC?
I'd have to give that one a little bit of thought, but there's a FAA magazine in October, November of 2018. It's an FAA safety magazine, and it's titled "Who's PIC?" and it's a phenomenal read. They've got scenarios, they've got questions in there, and that very question is answered in that article. And I would research that article, and I would be able to give you an answer for that.
Okay. Okay, could you provide some examples of operating under 61-113B, both legal and illegal?
Can you say again that question, Don?
Could you provide some examples of operating under 61-113B, both legal and illegal?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, 61-113B addresses flights where the private pilot was conducting the flight incidental to their business. Is that, am I reading that? I don't have my FAR right in front of me. I believe that to be what the rule is, and incidental to business. In other words, you're working for a company, your job is not as a pilot, but incidental to that time period, maybe you're salaried, you conduct a flight on and transport somebody in the business, but you're not compensated directly for that flight. You're compensated because of your employment elsewhere. That would be incidental. If you're compensated specifically for flying, that would not be incidental.
And
Maybe you can say that better.
the second example would be number 2 says that the aircraft does not carry passengers or property for compensation or hire. If you were a traveling salesman, but your company charged for the vendor for the product that you were selling to get on the aircraft and fly with you, you would have been incidental to the business if you were doing your route. But the fact that your company charged the vendor for the products that you were selling for the seat to ride along with you, that wouldn't be good. So I think that's 2 examples for you for B there.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Okay, once again, I want to remind everyone to send your questions via email to safeaircharter@faa.gov, and we're just about 8:13. I would like to thank the audience, okay, and panelists for joining, watching, and participating. More information can be found at the FAA Safe Air Charter website, and that is, again, faa.gov/go/safeaircharter. Okay, and again, just Google that and it will pop up. If there's any questions, you can post them in the comment section. And once again, thank you. Everyone take care, and everyone be safe out there.